personal vices can be public virtues, that individual bad behavior can have social ends. And that later appears again in Adam Smith, in a way, as the invisible hand. So, idea would be the entrepreneur in pursuing profit ends up making an investment that helps everyone in society. And so I had the idea that one way to think about the relationship between Carter as an individual and Carter as a historical actor, as a president, was to take his private personal virtues and relate them to public vices, right? To reverse this formula.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. If I sound a bit somber, it's because Jimmy Carter, the former U.S. president, is dead. No, that happened over a week ago, and he was 100. And there might be other reasons to not lament his demise, which we'll find out in just a second why. My name's Alex Hochuli. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil, joined by contributing editor to BungaCast, Alex Gourevitch. And I'd like to welcome our guest today, Tim Barker, who's a writer and historian living in New York. His Substack is called Origins of Our Time, and it's a piece that he's written on there about Jimmy Carter, which we'll be discussing today. He also has an occasional newsletter I'm informed is very good called Weapons of the Week, Week WEK. Hi, both.
Hi, thanks for having me, Alex.
Howdy.
Yeah, good to have you on. So, just to set this up, we're doing... I'm not sure Jimmy Carter would be of the kind of historical stature to dedicate an episode to, insofar as we've done episodes about Silvio Berlusconi, of course, and also Gorbachev when he died. I'm trying to think of whether we've done any others. Carter's not of that stature, but there is a good reason, I think, to be discussing him, which we'll find out in just a second. But, the fact of his death, I think, may have gone unnoticed outside of the U.S. It certainly kind of passed me by, but also it was like the 29th of December. Your attentions are normally elsewhere at that time of year. But in the U.S., I don't know. I'm interested whether this created any sort of splash. But U.S. history, this is my impression at least, is written as presidential history. Every presidential name implies a presidential epoch, even if that's completely misleading as to what's actually going on. And so you're prompted to think, okay, what did Carter mean? What was the Carter age actually about? And my read on it is that it was, people interpreted it as like a last moment of decency, a good guy in politics, before the fall into something maybe more self-seeking or corrupt or conflictual. I'm not really sure. I will let the Americans here inform me. So let's get started. Tim, firstly, just if you could fill us in the basic facts of Jimmy Carter's life. When was he president? Where did he come from? How did he make his way into professional politics?
Sure. I really like what you were saying, Alex, about the way that American history gets told as presidential history. And I've often felt as a historian of the United States that I'm like wrestling with the history, trying to make it interesting and not feel like a high school lesson, because often you think, oh my God, I really have to read about Dwight Eisenhower or something, but you do. These people were very powerful and they did have an impact, although often in the context of forces beyond their control. Jimmy Carter was the president between 1977 and 1981. So he was elected in the 76 election when he defeated Gerald Ford, who had become president upon the resignation of Richard Nixon. And then in the 1980 election, Carter was beaten by Ronald Reagan, not as decisively as Walter Mondale would be defeated by Reagan in 1984, but pretty clearly nonetheless. Carter came from Georgia, originally from a very small town called Archery, later associated with Plains, Georgia. And the Carter Library and Center is in Atlanta. So certainly a figure in Georgia politics. He became nationally known first as the governor of Georgia. And we can talk more later if we want about what sort of a politician he was in the context of the 70s in the U.S. South. But he comes in to the White House certainly marketed as an outsider, a sort of plain-speaking outsider who can redeem the nation and its goodness after what Ford had called the long national nightmare of Watergate and the Nixon resignation. The truth is that, he always had establishment connections. By the time he was running for president in 1976, he had already become a kind of protege of the people running the Trilateral Commission, which now sounds like something you would hear about on a weird YouTube channel with crazy people, but it was a real thing with powerful people, including David Rockefeller, quite involved. But Carter certainly didn't look or sound like a typical politician, and he wouldn't remind anyone of Richard Nixon, certainly.
Right, right. I mean, the contrast with Nixon, I guess, is the most striking thing if you look at the 1970s. But I think people have thought about Carter also in terms of what happened after his presidency, and that's influenced, right? Alex.
Yeah, sort of before we get to your own appraisal, Tim, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit. I can't think of another president who is so known for what he was like after his presidency, Carter. So I was wondering if you could tell us both sort of what he was known for and whether there was, I mean, not only is he known for it, but he's admired for what he did post presidency. So, sort of fill us in on what is it that he did post presidency? Why is he admired? And then sort of take us in to why you think that there's some reason for pause with respect to this reputation.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that if you did some sort of large language study of discourse about Jimmy Carter, the phrase most accomplished post presidency would certainly be very large in that word cloud. It's become a cliche, especially in contrast to what people view as his failure as a president, and that failure can be viewed alternately by sympathetic observers as the failure of good intentions, or by people who are right of center as the failure of failed approaches to government. But everyone seems to agree, right and left of center, that his post presidency was remarkable and worthy of praise. And I think you can think about the features of his post presidency that have attracted people in terms of something he didn't do and something he did do. The thing he didn't do was pursue wealth and celebrity with the single-minded drive that we've seen in Bill Clinton, Barack Obama. Joe Biden might be too old for that now, but Biden did recently tell the New York Times that his big regret is he didn't make more money from politics earlier. And they, repeated that as a normal thing a president would say. And so I think in that context, clearly we could contrast here with Berlusconi or, European figures who you guys have talked about as well. Carter came across as someone who continued to wear very cheap clothing, to volunteer and work with his hands to build houses for poor people through Habitat for Humanity, and generally to devote himself to higher purposes than merely piling up money and influence and assembling the best possible guest list for his birthday parties. The thing that he did do positively was a kind of freelance diplomacy at large, where he would visit troubled regions throughout the world, observe elections, try to mediate conflicts, get hostages released, pursue public health goals in poorer countries, and in the cases of somewhere like Israel and Palestine, try to figure out a way forward to resolve conflicts which seemed irresolvable to many people currently in office. And so he had a kind of I'm trying to think if there's another good comparison. I mean, Jesse Jackson at different points did things like this. Dennis Rodman, I guess, went to North Korea or had some, outreach to the North Koreans. So sort of that nature of thing.
The only time Jimmy Carter and Dennis Rodman will ever be uttered in the same sentence doing the same thing. Yeah. So one thing that you mentioned is that not only did he sort of not seek to enrich himself, but he seemed to embody certain personal virtues. He was honest, thrifty, hardworking, charitable, morally upright, and when you, as you said, you contrast that to, what did first thing Obama did when he left office was to go take a vacation on Richard Branson's private island. There's something really extravagant about that kind of move. And in contrast, Carter seemed to be a good person doing the things that a good person does, and not just doing the things a good person does, but modeling them in his behavior. And in the obituary that you wrote, you sort of encouraged the reader to do two things. One is to remember Carter for what he did as president, not post-president. And the second, once we look at what he was like as a president, we see that all of these personal virtues actually have a pretty deep connection to who he was as a president, namely as a president who really turned the United States in a neoliberal direction. And that from that standpoint, his personal virtues start to look less admirable. So I wonder if you could sort of explain to us in what sense he was the first neoliberal president. What were the things he did as opposed that just kind of happened in the wider world? How did he, I think you put it, he sort of intentionally promoted these developments, even if he obviously didn't single-handedly cause them?
Yeah, so just as you say, Alex, I had the feeling that public reaction to Carter's death and evaluation of his legacy felt kind of bifurcated, where people saw the presidency as separate from his admirable qualities and from his admirable post-presidency. And so I was curious about, as a historian, I generally think things tend to be related rather than separate. And so I was curious what sort of relationship there was. And I was thinking also of, there's a famous text in the history of political economy called The Fable of the Bees.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gourevitch, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.